The story of the miller and the merchant's son. A long time ago in a certain land, there was a terrible chaos. Its consequences were extremely dire. People had nothing to eat, many people died and were hungry. There is a person about to pass away. He only had one son, so he left all his inheritance to him. Before he died, he told his son, "Never do business with a bearded person." There was a sack of wheat left in the house, so the merchant's son decided to grind it to make cakes for the whole family to eat. He went to the miller's house and knocked on the door. The miller came out, and immediately the merchant's son saw that he had a beard. Remembering his father's advice, he said goodbye to the miller and went to grind elsewhere. But there, the person who opened the door was also a bearded miller. The merchant's son greeted him again and turned away. When he arrived at the third miller's house, he also met a bearded man. Unable to be picky forever, he had to ask a third person to grind the flour for him. When the grinding was finished, the miller asked the merchant's son for some flour to make bread for his children. He pleaded, "My children have not eaten bread for a long time." The merchant's son agreed. The miller then brought out a large basin and scooped some flour into it. At the same time, he added water to knead the dough. But the dough was too dry, so the miller added more water. So flabby again. More flour. So dry again. Add more water. It went on like that until the merchant's son's bag of flour was empty. Finally, the miller kneaded the bread and got a large loaf of bread. When he learned that the miller had deceived him, the merchant's son remembered his father's advice and saw that he was right. He thought for a moment and then said to the miller, "You took all my flour without leaving any for my children. So now you and I should each tell a boastful story. Whoever tells it better will get the other loaf of bread." The miller agreed and began telling his story. "My father was a farmer. One time he planted watermelons, but only one grew. It was so big that it covered the whole city. The national highway has its wires crawling through it. No horse, no cart could go. The watermelon tree remained in the city for a long time because there was no way to remove it." After listening to the miller, the merchant's son began to tell his story. "My grandfather was a beekeeper. One day he suddenly saw the queen bee flying back to the nest. Not long after, seeing the queen bee being yoked to the plow by a farmer instead of an ox, my grandfather immediately said, 'This is the queen bee in my hive. Please give it back to me.' The farmer replied, 3 days ago my horse died. I had to stop plowing the field because I didn't have a horse to pull the plow." But my grandfather did not agree to give the farmer the queen bee, so he had to pay. On the way back, he suddenly saw that the bee had an ulcer on its neck, where the plow yoke had stuck to it. My grandfather searched for the best medicine to apply to it, but to no avail. Finally, he crushed a grain of barley into powder and sprinkled it on the wound. Then he lay down under the shade of a tree and took a nap. When he woke up, he couldn't believe his eyes. Next to the tree he was lying on, another buckwheat tree grew. My grandfather understood that the tree grew from the buckwheat powder in the queen bee's wound. A giant buckwheat grain hangs from the tree. My grandfather wanted to pick it, so he picked up a handful of soil and threw it. A field appears above the trees. That vast field is full of wheat. My grandfather gathered all the wheat, cleaned it, and brought it to the miller. The miller grinds the wheat grain into flour and then makes a large loaf of bread. Then my grandfather went home. Speaking of the last sentence, the merchant's son carried a huge loaf of bread and brought it home. Thank you for joining us for today's fairy tale. We hope these stories bring joy and meaning to your day. If you love our channel, please hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any exciting tales. Wishing you a good night and sweet dreams. See you in the next story.